I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who could cheat. Growing up, love meant loyalty, sacrifice, and endurance. But life twists ideals until they barely resemble what you once believed in. For years, I stayed in my marriage for one reason: our son, Ethan. He was 8, bright-eyed, curious, and full of questions about everything from dinosaurs to why mommy always seemed so tired. Staying felt like drowning, but leaving wasn't an option while Ethan still needed both of us. My husband Daniel wasn't a bad man. That's what made this whole mess harder to stomach. He worked hard, paid the bills, and showed up at parent-teacher conferences with a smile. To anyone else, we probably looked like the perfect family, a little too quiet maybe, but solid. What no one saw were the cracks beneath the surface, widening every time he said something dismissive or ignored how unhappy I felt. Daniel had rules, unspoken ones that governed our lives. One of them lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. The only reason I would ever leave you is if you cheated on me. At first, I thought it was just another offhand comment, but over time, it became my lifeline. You see, I wanted out. Not because I hated Daniel, but because staying felt suffocating. Every morning, I woke up next to him and wondered how much longer I could pretend everything was fine. Conversations revolved around logistics, school pickups, grocery lists, weekend plans. There was no laughter anymore, no spark, just two people, going through the motions while their hearts calcified. But leaving wasn't an option, not while Ethan still needed both of us. So instead, I tried to push Daniel away, subtly at first. I stopped initiating conversations, let dishes pile up, avoided making dinner unless absolutely necessary. When that didn't work, I got bolder. I snapped at him over small things, criticized his choices, picked fights about money or parenting styles. Anything to make him angry enough to walk away himself. It didn't work. No matter what I did, Daniel stayed. He apologized for arguments. I started, promised to do better, acted like he was the problem. His stubbornness infuriated me. How could he refuse to see what I needed? Why couldn't he just let me go? And then came the idea, the desperate, reckless plan that took root late one night as I lay awake staring at the ceiling. If Daniel wouldn't leave me, maybe I could force his hand. Cheating wasn't something I ever imagined doing, but suddenly it seemed like the only way out. A twisted logic settled over me. If I broke his trust, he'd have no choice but to end things. And finally, I'd be free. It started innocently enough, or as innocent as betrayal can start. James was a co-worker, someone I'd known casually for years. He worked in IT, troubleshooting issues for the marketing department where I spent my days crafting social media campaigns. We'd exchanged pleasantries before, small talk about deadlines or the weather, but nothing more. Then one day, during a particularly grueling week, he stopped by my desk with coffee. "You look like you need this," he said, setting the cup down beside my keyboard. I glanced up, surprised. "Thanks. You didn't have to do that." He shrugged, smiling faintly. "Figured everyone could use a pick-me-up today. Besides, you've been putting out fires all week. Thought you deserved it." That moment shouldn't have meant anything. People bring each other coffee all the time. It's not exactly groundbreaking behavior. But there was something in the gesture, something genuine that caught me off guard. Maybe it was the fact that no one had done something thoughtful for me in ages, certainly not Daniel. Or maybe it was the way James lingered just long enough to ask how I was holding up before heading back to his office. Whatever it was, it stuck with me. Over the next few weeks, our interactions grew less formal. He began stopping by more often, asking about projects I was working on or sharing stories about his dog. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, I found myself looking forward to those brief exchanges. They weren't extraordinary, just snippets of normalcy in a life that felt increasingly suffocating, but they reminded me what it felt like to be seen, really seen. Then came the night we stayed late to finish a project. The office was eerily quiet, lit only by the glow of computer screens. As we wrapped up, James suggested grabbing a drink nearby. My initial instinct was to decline. I knew better than to blur professional boundaries, but exhaustion won out. "Sure," I said, surprising even myself. We ended up at a dimly lit bar downtown, tucked into a corner booth far from prying eyes. Conversation flowed easily between us, touching on everything from childhood memories to frustrations with work. For the first time in years, I felt lighter, like I could breathe again. When James leaned across the table and asked why I seemed so guarded, I hesitated. Telling him the truth felt dangerous, but keeping it bottled up felt worse. "I'm married," I admitted finally, tracing the condensation on my glass. "But it's complicated." To his credit, James didn't judge. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully. Complicated is a good word for it sometimes. That night marked the beginning of something I couldn't undo. Over the following weeks, our meetings became more frequent, our conversations deeper. Each encounter left me feeling torn, guilty for betraying Daniel, yet exhilarated by the attention James gave me. Eventually, lines blurred beyond recognition. What started as stolen moments in parking lots escalated into hotel rooms and whispered promises neither of us intended to keep. The unraveling happened faster than I expected. I thought I had more time, more control over how and when Daniel would find out. But secrets are fragile things, especially when guilt starts seeping through the cracks. It began subtly, with Daniel, noticing changes in my routine. I'd come home later than usual, claiming overtime at work. My phone buzzed incessantly, and though I tried to silence it discreetly, Daniel's curiosity grew sharper. One evening, after another lie about staying late, I walked into the kitchen to find him sitting at the table, scrolling through his phone. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in the room was palpable. "Where were you tonight?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with suspicion. "Work," I replied quickly, avoiding eye contact as I set my bag down. "Why?" He held up his phone, showing me a photo someone had sent him anonymously. A grainy image of me walking into a hotel with James. My stomach dropped. The world tilted slightly, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. "This doesn't look like work," Daniel said, his tone icy now. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay composed. "It's not what it looks like." "Don't," he cut me off sharply. "Just don't." For the first time since we'd met, I saw real anger in his eyes. Not frustration or disappointment, but raw fury. He stood abruptly, pacing the length of the kitchen before turning back to me. "You said you'd never cheat on me. That's the one thing I told you I wouldn't tolerate. I didn't plan for this to happen," I stammered, tears welling up despite my efforts to hold them back. "I didn't want to hurt you." "Didn't want to hurt me?" he repeated, incredulous. "You think this isn't hurting? Do you have any idea what this does to us? To Ethan?" His words hit like a punch to the gut. Until that moment, I'd managed to compartmentalize everything. The affair, the lies, the reasons behind it all. But hearing Daniel mention Ethan shattered whatever flimsy justification I'd built in my mind. Guilt crashed over me in waves, heavier than anything I'd ever felt. "I'm sorry," I whispered, but the words sounded hollow, even to me. Daniel shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "Sorry isn't enough. Not this time." We argued for hours that night, voices rising and falling as accusations flew between us. He demanded answers I wasn't ready to give, and I clung desperately to fragments of explanations that only made things worse. By the time we finally fell silent, exhausted and drained, the damage was done. Our marriage, already fragile, lay in ruins. In the days that followed, I struggled to piece together some semblance of normalcy for Ethan's sake. But the shame was relentless, gnawing at me whenever I looked at Daniel or heard Ethan call for Daddy. I'd convinced myself that cheating would set me free, but instead, it trapped me in a new kind of misery, one far darker and lonelier than anything I'd experienced before. Living under the same roof became unbearable. Every glance, every shared meal, every bedtime story with Ethan felt like a performance, a brittle facade masking the wreckage underneath. I couldn't stand seeing the hurt in Daniel's eyes or hearing the forced cheerfulness in his voice when he spoke to our son. Worse still, I couldn't escape the knowledge that I'd caused it all. Finally, I made the decision to leave. It wasn't dramatic or impulsive. It was quiet, deliberate, and achingly final. I packed my things late one night while Daniel slept, careful not to wake him or Ethan. As I zipped up my suitcase, I paused to look around the bedroom we'd shared for nearly a decade. Memories flooded back, some happy, most bittersweet, and I allowed myself a single sob before steeling my resolve. The next morning, I sat Ethan down and explained as gently as I could that Mommy needed to live somewhere else for a while. His confusion broke my heart, but I promised him it wasn't his fault and that I'd see him every chance I got. Then, I hugged him tightly, memorizing the feel of his small arms around my neck. Leaving Daniel was harder. He didn't beg me to stay or lash out in anger. Instead, he simply nodded, his jaw clenched tight. "Take care of yourself," he said stiffly, his voice devoid of warmth. As I drove away, tears streaming down my face, I felt both relief and devastation. Relief that I was finally free of the suffocating life I'd created for myself, and devastation at the cost of that freedom. The road ahead stretched long and uncertain, but for the first time in years, I felt like I was choosing my own path. Whether it led to redemption or ruin, only time would tell.
With this story or found it thought-provoking, please take a moment to like and subscribe for more content that dives deep into the complexities of human emotions. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us continue bringing stories that resonate with real-life experiences. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. How would you have handled this situation? Let's start a conversation about love, trust, and redemption.